Hello, everyone, and welcome to All Blaze No Glory, the podcast. This is part one of Fraternising with the Enemy. So I'm joined by AP Cronje, Springboks fan extraordinaire, South African rugby Twitter darling. How are you doing?
I'm doing very, very well, and you've given me a very nice intro there. I'm not sure if I'm the darling of South African rugby Twitter. Sometimes I'm very much the devil there, but yeah, thanks so much for having me on. Looking forward to it.
Good, good. And first and foremost, before we get into the Rugby World Cup, and obviously Scotland and South Africa are in the same group with Ireland, somehow the top five teams in the world at one point. How did you get into rugby? What made you fall in love with the game?
Oh, I mean that's a brilliant question. I guess growing up in a rugby household, my dad was big rugby supporter, my mum as well. So I think as usual, it sort of comes down from your parents a lot of the time. So I sort of always grew up watching rugby, playing rugby when I was schooled actually in England. I live in England. But I've been playing rugby since I was six. I've done sort of most things in the game, done a bit of coaching, done a bit of refereeing. So yeah, I think that over time your interest just gets deeper and deeper, and I think that's sort of what led me eventually to go into sort of the journalism route when I realized my playing days were nearing their end. So I do sort of a bit of freelance rugby journalism from time to time as well, and obviously you'll know that I'm pretty active on Twitter. But yeah, I suppose the genesis of everything is familial, is from my dad.
Fair enough, and I think that's possibly quite common across the board for most people in rugby now. Um, uh, I didn't have that journey actually. My rugby days just started because I was rubbish at football at school and wanted to try something. um, um, so obviously South Africa have now got the rugby championship coming up, um, and there was a bit of a strange debate on Twitter. That I sort of engaged in saying that South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, they have a bigger advantage going into the World Cup because of the Rugby Championship. Do you agree with that? Because the Six Nations obviously earlier, or do you think that it's not really that big an advantage to those teams? Sorry.
So it's a risk reward element really, because ultimately, so look, first point to note is that it's a shortened rugby championship. It's only 3 games. So whereas you had the full Six Nations tournament early in the year, this is very much a curtailed rugby championship, which is why you'll see that South Africa has got 3 warm-up games, even following the Rugby Championship, one against Argentina, Buenos Aires, then against Wales, and then against the All Blacks again. So clearly the minds in the Springbok camp have decided that for them, optimum preparation is to have 6 competitive games of international rugby. But ultimately, you do get that risk. You've got guys like Andre Pollard who are sort of perennially injured, but are crucial for us. And he's out for the entirety of the Rugby Championship. Eben Etzebeth's an incredibly important player. He's out now. Siya Kolisi's out for the time being. So all these guys should hopefully, fingers crossed, be ready for the World Cup. But you get other guys who might suffer injuries, and ultimately, if you suffer a serious injury now, that's your World Cup done. That this is now very much last chance saloon, as it were. So there's always going to be that risk. But on the flip side, there's the opportunity to explore the different combinations. I expect we'll see Manie Libbok start for South Africa at 10 against Australia. I think that's the feeling. A guy who's not had, I believe, any starts at fly half, but is an important combination to look to develop before going into the World Cup. So it gives you an opportunity to test your squad depth, to make those final decisions as who gets into that 33-man squad. And I think statistically, it has been shown that teams do tend to do better for being, so-called battle hardened going into the competition. So it's a really tricky one to say, and I suppose it'll always be a post facto justification or rationalization. We'll see if New Zealand, South Africa, Australia do very poorly at the World Cup, everyone's going to say, well, you can pinpoint the Rugby Championship if you like, and vice versa. If they do very well, they might say, well, they've had the opportunity to really be battle hardened and sharp ahead of the competition. So it's always a tricky one to say. My personal feeling is that I'm pretty glad that we will have this opportunity to sort of have a proper international hit out.
Cool. And do you think that there's a sort of balance to be struck in the rugby championship with experimenting with some of the combinations you might need for the World Cup and giving some people game time versus wanting to win the Rugby Championship, which is obviously quite prestigious in itself? Is there some kind of balance that you see from the coaches when you have these ones just before the World Cup?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, obviously, the last time it was in 2019. The last time it was obviously before the World Cup, and South Africa won that one in a curtailed competition as well. I think that, disparagingly, people sometimes say, well, it doesn't really matter in a World Cup. It's a shortened competition. It doesn't have the prestige because you're sort of focusing on the main event later in the year. But obviously, clearly for South Africa, they did something right to win that and then go on and win the World Cup. So I suppose winning is a habit, and to carry forward momentum is really important. So yeah, I think there will always be, those that sort of naysay the Rugby Championship in a World Cup year and say, well, it's not really that important. And to an extent, that's probably true. I mean, it isn't the main focus for the coaches this year. That will, of course, be the World Cup, which is in only a few months' time. But having said that, it does still carry some weight. And yeah, particularly, you can balance developing your squad depth, but ultimately everybody still wants to win. And I think that we'll see that in the opening round this coming weekend. They'll probably be tearing into each other, going hell for leather as usual.
Good. And for people not quite as familiar with the South African squad, is there anyone sort of that's maybe a bit fresher that people should be looking out for come Rugby Championship World Cup time, that maybe people in Europe or on Scotland and stuff won't be quite so aware of?
Yeah, I think two guys come to mind. The first guy is someone I've mentioned already, is Marnie Leboeck. I think that if you follow the URC, you'll sort of be more aware of him as obviously the Stormers starting 10. He is very much had a fledgling Springbok career at the moment. He went in the end of year tour, played a bit against Italy, and I believe actually made his debut against France. But he is sort of an out and out fly half, and is the only one who's fit in the squad at the moment. So for the Rugby Championship squad, 100 Pollard's unlikely to play any games. So the two people that we have at fly half, or sorry, someone's been brought in, but the two people who are likely to go to the World Cup if Pollard is fit are Marnie Leboeck and Damien Willemse. Now Willemse is more of a I hate to use the term utility player, but he doesn't strike me as a natural fly half. He sort of plays fullback, plays fly half, plays inside centre. He's a very versatile player in that regard, a bit like Francis Steyn, actually. And then you have Marnie Leboeck. So there's a lot resting on his shoulders doing the Rugby Championship in terms of the South African coaches will hopefully expect him to take the step up to test level. And I think he's sort of the darling of South African rugby, but he's also a polarizing figure. I mean, his detractors will say that he doesn't have the temperament. When the big moments come, he doesn't perform, and they'll cite the the URC final as an example of that, where he had a pretty poor game. But his sponsors will say, no, actually, the previous year he was instrumental in guiding them to winning the URC, and he was very good throughout the knockouts, barring the final. I fall into the latter camp. I actually do think that he'll take the step up, and I think that he's a key player for South Africa going forward because of the transition. I think we're going to see in the coming World Cup in the style of play. I think that there was some visions of it in the end of year tour last year. I think that the Springboks are sort of moving towards developing their play. I think that they've done it 2 years later than the rest of the world has, because COVID basically stopped all rugby in South Africa for basically a year and a half. And then they had the Lions series. And so they went into a hyper-conservative, win at all costs style of play. The very boring kick chase style that we've become accustomed to, because, that was their strength. So they doubled down on it. But I think we've seen hints about them varying that play. And I think Marnie Leboeck at 10 is going to be pretty instrumental. So I'm quite excited to see how he goes in the Rugby Championship. And then the other guy, very briefly, is Canan Moodie. He made his debut last year in the Rugby Championship. He's Bulls winger. I believe he's only 20 or 21 years old, very young guy. Massive international future. He's, I believe Jacques Nienaber said he's one of the most talented guys he's ever coached. There's a lot of expectation on his shoulder to go on and do big things. It's unlikely that he'll be starting, the big World Cup games, because ultimately they've got a very settled back three in Willie LaRue, Chazan Colby, and Makazole Mapimpi. But I expect we'll see him feature a lot in the Rugby Championship and go to the World Cup as a squad member. And if there is any injuries, he'll slot in. So those are two guys who perhaps Northern Hemisphere rugby fans may not be as familiar with, particularly Kane and Moody. But yeah, I think two guys are very exciting.
Cool, cool. And you mentioned obviously that South Africa kind of typecast as this boring outfit. Actually, funnily enough, so are Ireland, the other team in the group at times. But they do have, in my opinion, some of the most exciting back three players in the world. Cheslin Kolbe gets his credit a lot. I actually think Mapimpi's a better winger than him. But who do you think goes in that back three in the squad? You've got obviously Aranzi as well as Moody and Willie LaRue. So, I mean, what would be your ideal back three for South Africa?
So yeah, it's a really good question. I think that Willie LaRue is pretty crucial, not just because of his skills at fullback, but ultimately what he brings to the box on attack. He basically runs the attacking show. It's kind of a weird sort of system in the box where 9 and 15 are running the attack. I mean, Pollard is a very good player and has many strengths, but it's always been Willie LaRue who sort of dictates how the attack flows and he makes the big calls at the big moments. So he's pretty crucial in that respect. So I expect he'll stay as the starting fullback. And then obviously you've got Cheslin Kolbe and Makazole Mapimpi. And I agree with you, actually. I think that Makazole Mapimpi is sometimes a bit of an underrated player. Even within South Africa, he has a surprising number of detractors. And I think that, as you say, on his pure skills as a winger, I actually do think that he's better than Kolbe. But obviously Kolbe brings that game-breaking element, and is just has the ability to produce moments of brilliance that few other players can. And then I think to round it out, the guys that will go to the World Cup are the two guys. One guy I mentioned, one that you just mentioned, Kurtley Arendse, I believe will go, and I believe Kane and Moody will go as well. And then you also have a guy like Damian Willems who very happily covers 15 if he needs to. So within those 5-6 guys, I suspect that's the outside backs that we'll see go to the World Cup. Those 3 regular starters plus Kane and Moody who can potentially slot in at 13 as well. Kurtley Arendse who covers both wings and 15, and then Damian Willems who again has covered 15, has played on the wing when there's been injuries. So I think the Springbok coaches like the versatility that playing group brings and their ability to sort of move around in that back three. So I think that justifies having that number.
Okay, and you mentioned earlier, obviously, at the 10 position, you've got Lippock and Pollard, presumably when fit, will come into the squad. Am I right in thinking that Pollard's played a little bit of 12? Would you maybe see him moving there if Lippock does well in the 10 jersey? To open up both of them playing akin to Farrell and Ford for England, say?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that we've sort of toyed with for a long time, South African supporters, particularly. I mean, Elton Jantjies is now back in the squad. He's been called up through the injury of Pollard. So, but when Jantjies and Pollard were both the two Springbok fly halves, as it were, which is from about 2017 onwards, what's been the case until now. There's been Damian Willems' emergence and Manie Libbok. But there was always the question of whether we'd have an actual game started with Jantjies at 10 and Pollard at 12, because we saw glimpses of it in the Rugby Championship. I want to say 2 years ago, there was moments where Pollard moved to 12 and Jantjies was at 10, because Jantjies has always been more of an attacking player, sort of brings the ball to the line, has very good vision. And in that same way, Manie Libbok is a player like that as well, is instinctively attack-minded, instinctively wants to look to put players away. And obviously we know that Pollard has the guts and the gumption to play at 12. He's a big guy, he's physical, he's everything that you'd expect in a typical South African 12. So there's that element of it. I believe there was some rumours in the press that we might see Damian Willems at 10 with Pollard at 12. So I think it's potential that they're going to look to explore that sort of dual playmaker role. It might be something that we see experimented with in the warm-up games, perhaps against Wales or against Argentina. So again, it's something that I think that we've not really seen from South Africa. It's something that a lot of people, myself included, have wanted to at least see given a go. So perhaps it's a bit late now for them to sort of do something like that. But looking forward to the next rotation, it might well be that we have something like Manie Libbok at 10 and Damian Willems at 12, where you've got that sort of dual playmaker role.
Well, and in terms of your centres at the moment, I mean, ordinarily, I think Am is the 13 jerseys his, but for injuries or whatever. I see here that they've also selected Dale Andy, who's normally at 12. Andre Esterhaven, sorry, that was terrible pronunciation. I've not seen a lot of him for Quins. Tell us a bit about him.
Yeah, I mean he's 6'4", 112, 110 kg, big guy, you know. So he's your quintessential crash ball 12, you know, gets you good meters over the advantage line. But I think that that's sort of how he was used when he was in South Africa at the Sharks. But since he's moved to Quins, just by virtue of being in a team that is, you know, prides their skills in terms of moving the ball, he's developed, you know, pretty massively as a player. I think his distribution game is something that's really grossly underrated. The amount of times you'll see him for Quins look like he's going to hit a short line, but then pull it out the back for Marcus Smith or pull it wide. It's sort of his size sort of belies actually how deft his handling is. And then his work on the ground is actually another really underrated element of his game. There was a period of time, I believe last year, that he went on to win like 4 man of the matches in the space of about 5 games, where he was making crucial turnovers at the last moment and, you know, really, really good on the deck. So he's a very versatile, physical, obviously, player. And I suspect we'll get to see him start against Australia this weekend coming. I think the feeling is that Armour's going to be at 13 with Estes at 12. I'm happy for him because he's sort of sat behind Damien Delinda, who is the primary South African inside centre. And there's been a few occasions where they've looked to play both Delinda and Esterhuizen, but to sort of it's not been that successful. Both of them are pretty much, you know, your classic inside centres. They probably don't quite have the pace to defend the 13 channel in the way that someone like or Jesse Creel can. So unfortunately for Andre Estes, and again, he was cited, I think, by Aled Bolters and Ninaba in 2019 as being one of the guys most unlucky not to go to the World Cup. I think this time around he might get the nod. I hope for his sake he does, because I think he's been tearing up trees for Quins, and he's been one of their sort of crucial players.
Cool. And just to sort of finish talking about the backs, obviously it was Faf de Klerk, Hendrikse, Jantes, I apologise for my pronunciation, Renak and Williams. I think most people here still think Faf de Klerk's like the man, but for you, is Faf still that guy, or is there another scrum half that's should be starting ahead of him?
No, I think that he's very much just a man. I think that what he brings in terms of his sort of defensive, you know, hustling and bustling in the opposition, the fact that he's just such for want of a better term, he's such an arse. He makes life incredibly uncomfortable for the opposition. He's just in your face. He's unrelenting. And then I think his actual, you know, he's so settled in the team, and he knows, you know, intimately how, you know, the ins and outs of the team, the game plan. I think he's very much the starting 9. But then below him, it's interesting because it's sort of the door's been thrown wide open. I think you've got Grubus Reinach, who's always very impressive and probably doesn't get as many starts as he deserves, just by virtue of the fact that Faf is so good. And then below them, you've got Grant Williams and Herschel Jantjies. So Jantjies is an interesting one because I think his form has probably dipped quite significantly in the last year or two. And he is one of the few guys who I think you could say didn't have a very good autumn tour. He was given a start. I believe it was actually against Scotland. He was given a start in pretty wet, torrid conditions. You'll be unsurprised to hear. And I think that I remember thinking that he just didn't have a very good outing. And so I think that he's there more on the basis that, you know, he's historically been part of the squad. And I'm talking about the Rugby Championship squad, but I suspect that how he performs in this tournament will be crucial in determining whether it's him or Grant Williams who goes to the World Cup. Because in Grant Williams, you have a guy who's been in absolutely phenomenal form. You know, he's possibly the quickest scrum half in South Africa, and that includes Grubus Reinach. I mean, you need only look at some of the tries he scored against Toulouse in the Champions Cup, where he just cut them open. So he's an unbelievably talented guy, and he's exactly the type of guy you want to bring on if you want to accelerate the game. So again, it depends on what style of play South Africa want to play. If you want to go quickly. And I suspect against some teams that might be the go-to. Then you're looking at someone like Reinach and Williams. But if you want a more controlled game, you're looking at someone like Jaden Hendricks, Faf de Klerk, Herschel Yankees potentially. But yeah, it's an area of Springbok rugby that there's been a lot of competition at the moment. Faf will go, Reinach will go, Jaden Hendricks, Herschel Yankees, or Grant Williams, one of those three, will go. So it's sort of over to them to see who really nails down the spot.
Cool. And then you've got I do like this South Africa, the way they've put their squad. They've got props, hookers, locks, loose forwards, utility forwards, which are obviously people that jump between the two. So it's quite nice. They're not boxed in. Someone who caught me watching URC, and I think it was particular an Edinburgh game, was Evan Roos. Do you think he's got a good chance to get on that plane to France?
I think he's got as good a chance as anybody in the forwards, really. I think that he's been sort of cited as the up and coming future Springbok eighth man. Because Duane Vermeulen, as we know, is now a veteran, and this will almost in all certainty be his final swan song. So he will almost certainly step away after the World Cup. You've then got Jasper Wiese, who's the current sort of incumbent starter. But then Evan Roos is the guy that everyone is incredibly excited about. And I think he had his breakthrough season last season in the URC. It was just monumental, was making meters for fun, was aggressive, good on the ground. And I think that the elements of his game that were probably keeping him out of the Springbok team, which were the fact that he wasn't really a line-out option, sometimes his maul defense was a bit shaky, didn't offer as much on the ground. Those are all elements of his game that has been quite notable that he's worked on this season. He's now much more of a line-out option for the Stormers. He's very good on the ground. So I think that it's exactly because he's gone away and worked on those elements of his game that he's now there. I think in South Africa, it's always sort of been between him and another guy called Ulrich Loh, who plays for the Bulls. There's, those two are sort of seen as the two big up-and-coming guys who are probably looking to eventually replace Duane Vermeulen and Pieter-Steph du Toit, respectively. And yeah, it's just a case that Roos has just picked Ulrich Loh into the squad, and you can't really blame the coaches. He's really been fantastic.
And in terms of your sort of back three makeup for South Africa, I mean, I think Mostert's started there as well a few times. They're all the back row for me is always terrifying for South Africa. But who would you have as your absolute top back three back row for South Africa?
So if the World Cup final was tomorrow and everyone was fit, you'd have Siya Kolisi, Pieter-Steph du Toit, and probably it's a really tricky one at eighth man, actually, because instinctively you want to say Duane Vermeulen because he's always been there. And what he offers around the park, he's brilliant in the air. They usually drop him back for kick receipt. He's fantastic. He's a line-out jumping option. He's marshals them all really well. He's incredibly important on defense. So for all his experience, he probably gets the start. But ultimately, you look at a guy like Jasper Wiese, and it's really tricky to exclude him because he's just such a go-forward option. And he's basically a batching ram for the Springboks, and he's exactly the type of guy who just carries and defends all day. He's a momentum stopper and a momentum giver, if that makes sense. So again, I think it will depend on who you're facing, whether you'll need someone a bit more attritional or whether you'll need someone who has that sort of wider skill set and experience. But yeah, all things considered, it's probably the same back three as you saw throughout the World Cup in 2019 and have seen since. It's Siya Kolisi, Duane Vermeulen, and Pieter-Steph du Toit is probably the starting back three.
Yeah, and just on the point of Wiese, he's got a bit of a reputation for being ill-disciplined and things like that. Do you think that's a bit unfair, or is that quite accurate?
No, I think it was accurate. I think it was accurate, not because I think that he's necessarily someone who's, deliberately like a dirty player. I don't get the impression he's someone like Lavanini who sort of is constantly on the wrong side of things. I think particularly when he started in the Premiership, I think by virtue of the fact that he is so abrasive physically, I think he just got his timings wrong a lot of the time. We saw lots of yellow cards given for flying into rucks and that type of thing. And ultimately that's technique. And I mean, the same could be said of Andre Estes in his first season as well. And someone like Jean-Luc Dupré, who's also in the squad now at the moment, where I think a lot of the time, it's adjusting to the interpretations and, in the Northern Hemisphere once you've come out of Super Rugby, which can be a bit of a free fall at times. So adjusting to those interpretations, adjusting to the fact that we have seen a move in the last sort of 3-4 years towards, looking at player safety in a way which we haven't done before, which is obviously a very positive thing. And you'll know I'm a big proponent of. So I think that there's an adjustment period for certain players. And I think that some get it quicker than others. And I think that someone like Bisa did take probably a year and a bit for him to really, really get there. So I think, yeah, it's tricky. You're always going to carry that type of reputation. And it's also one of those things that comes with playing the type of game you do, right? If you are a abrasive, physical, aggressive guy, you're always going to be on the edge, and people are always going to sort of look at you and what you're doing and think, well, there's elements of illegality there. So it's not unfair to say that he's had his issues with discipline. I don't think it's malicious, as I say. I think it's more just technique issues usually. But it's something that I think he is aware of, and the box will be aware of. I think that the discipline for South Africa over the last World Cup was very, very good overall. Over the last sort of year or two, I think they've struggled in parts, and I think there's been a big emphasis on them getting sort of good clarity in their training from referees. I know they tried to rope in Nigel Owens to play that role, to basically be an almost a go-between, and to give them pointers in their training to make sure that they're pretty spot on in how they coach the ruck and how they coach the maul, et cetera, et cetera. And they've now had Jaco Paper working with the team as well. And I think it's a trend we're seeing in rugby that's probably going to go forward. I think that, you see France do the same thing, where they've had former international referees working with their international side, because those guys just give you an insight into, how certain elements of the game are being refereed.
Cool. And front row, is always a weird one for me with South Africa, because they don't seem to have just one starting front row. They seem to always have two. Is that like something that's likely to continue in the World Cup, where you're going to have the bomb squad, as it's called, or do you think there'll be more of a kind of traditional, 60-20 minute split, or will it still be that we could get to halftime 39 minutes? I think they done it with Scotland, and they changed the whole front row when Scotland were ahead, then never looked back. How do you think they're going to play the front row, and who do you see as being the most important guys in the South African front row?
So it's an interesting one, but I think actually almost counterintuitively, the bomb squad is prefaced upon being able to select two locks, not so much on the front row. So if you look at the World Cup in 2019, the reason they could go with that 6-2 split is because they had Archie Snyman on the bench and Franco Mostert on the bench. So Snyman meant that you could bring off Etzebeth and lose no power, and Mostert meant that you covered both Luat de Jager at 5, or if something went wrong, Peter Stift at Toy at 7. So that was sort of the genesis of having that, which meant that you can then have a guy like Walker Smith as well on the bench, and you have those 6 forwards. So we've struggled really to be able to do a proper so-called bomb squad since then, because we've not really had a replacement for lock, tight head lock. Now, just by virtue, thank you, Munster, we've now got 2 back in Jean Klein and Atlius Neyman, which then opens the door again, I believe, to doing a proper bomb squad. And now, sort of turning to your question in terms of the front row, yeah, I do think that's the plan. I think that you're going to see the 2 sort of front rows utilized in probably in a similar way as they were. You don't have a starting South African front row in a conventional sense, because I think that they are so used to playing certain combinations. So I think that you'll see Ox and Cher, Bongi Mbonambi, and possibly Vincent Koch. They play very well as a combination, whereas you've got Stephen Kitzel, Frans Malherbe, and Malcolm Marx. They play very well as a combination. So I think that South Africa have a lot of strength and depth in the front row, and how they manage those workloads is going to be interesting. But I expect that we will see something that we've seen since 2017, which is that that sort of hooking everyone at sort of 50 minutes, 45 minutes, and giving the next guys on a proper crack at it.
Yeah, and does it upset South Africans that their best tight head prop is playing for Scotland?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of love. I take it you mean VPNL, right?
Or... Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of love for him and for Skumis. I think that whenever South Africans go abroad, I think most of the time people are very, very happy for them if they go on and be successful. And I can tell you that I don't think it was this Six Nations when you beat England, although I was very much out of my feet for that as well. But I believe it was the last one where I think VPNL came on and won a pretty crucial penalty very late in the game. And yeah, it was just absolute pandemonium in my household for sure. So I think yeah, obviously frustrating that he's not in South Africa. He's a Free State boy, but no, I mean he's had an amazing career for Scotland, and he just never seems to stop. I think that it was after the Calcutta Cup. I think he tweeted something. It was just like we're only getting started. I was like, I think you're like 45 years old, mate. What do you mean you're only getting started?
Yeah.
But yeah, he's such a big personality as well. But he's great.
Cool, cool. And looking at the World Cup, I would imagine South Africa and Ireland South Africa and Ireland are the favourites to get out of that group. Is there any small part of you or the people other South African fans that are a little bit worried about getting out of the group in the World Cup?
Yeah, I mean, there's no way you can be in that group and not have it in your mind that ultimately you've got three of the top five teams in the world, in the same group, and only two go through. So I think that you'd be mad not to worry about that. I mean, you can't just write off any team. And we talk a lot about the three teams of Scotland, the tier one teams, as it were, of Scotland, Ireland, and South Africa. But ultimately, you've got some pretty big hitters outside of that as well. So I don't think it's going to be an easy group at all. I think that from a South African perspective, I'm quite glad that we're playing Scotland first up, mostly because I believe that if we'd had Ireland first and we'd lost that game, then everything with the extra pressure, I can see Scotland really pulling an upset. I think as it is, South Africa will of course fancy themselves against Scotland. They'll fancy themselves against Ireland as well. That's the attitude you have to have if you're going to win tournaments. But as a fan, it makes me very, very nervous. I think that Scotland have always been one of those teams that when they play South Africa are there or thereabouts for a while, and then towards the end of the game we've sort of come good and not run away with it, but we've then been comfortable in victory. But I think that but yeah, anything can happen in these World Cups, and I think that Scotland are definitely a team that have they have the players certainly, and we've seen that. So whether Tooney can pull off an upset it remains to be seen. Obviously, I hope not, but I'm sure you feel differently.
Well, I'd like to think we beat one of the two teams in there. I mean, if I could pick one to go out, I'm being honest, I'd rather it was Ireland, but that's just because the years of Leinster and yeah. So what scares you the most about Scotland? I know that sounds a little bit foolhardy saying what scares you the most, like we're terrifying, but what part of Scotland's game gives you the most cause for concern?
I think Scotland's wide game. I think their ability in the back line to basically, everyone knows their attacking ability. And when they start getting on the front foot, when you've got guys like, Finn Russell and Hugh Jones playing extremely well, I think that becomes very dangerous for South Africa. Our defensive structure is basically prefaced around trying to compress the space, be incredibly quick on the line speed, put the decision makers under enormous amounts of pressure. But I think that if there are teams that are able to sort of go around South Africa and play wide and get the better of that defense, it is teams like Scotland. I mean, we saw it a bit in the autumn with Ireland, actually. I think Ireland unlocked South Africa's defense out wide a few times. And I think Scotland are another team that have the ability to do that, particularly because they've got sort of playmakers, 9, 10, 12, 15. So, they've got guys who can do that. So that's one element that worries me. I think the power game that someone like Tuipulotu brings, for example, I think that we've got that element of the game covered pretty well because we've got very physical guys in the 10-12 channel. And so I'm less concerned, truthfully speaking, about that. And it's the same reason that I'm less concerned about someone like Bunde Aki from Ireland. I think that the power game that guys like that bring, I don't think is as effective against South Africa. What worries me more is playmakers being able to get around that rush defense, particularly because because it's such a high risk, high reward defense. Guys who are new to the system who don't get it, they can make incorrect reads and get really badly punished for it. So if you have an injury to, say, someone like Cheslin Kolbe, which has been known to happen, unfortunately, and happened in the previous World Cup actually, if you then have a new guy in the system like a Kane and Moody, I mean, it's only one split second that you make an incorrect read and you're just not used to the system. And that's, 5 points, potentially seven, and, that can decide a game. So I think that's the element of Scotland's play, probably tempo, and that comes from Ben White as well. I think that like the tempo and their playmakers in the back line is what concerns me. And I think the counter to that is obviously the classic one. Whenever you are faced with that as a South African, is you just have to basically put them under an immense amount of pressure on the forwards, make sure they don't get any clean ball, try and be as suffocating as possible, keep the game on your terms, kick well, all the classics that we see. But yeah, that would be my concern I get about playing Scotland.
Yeah, and if there was one Scotland player that you could pick, and since we do it to South Africa all the time, you could pick in the South African squad, who would it be? I suppose you might just take one of the South Africans back, but who would you pick for South Africa from the Scotland squad and stick in a South African shirt?
It's an interesting one because I think I mean, I'd love to have a guy like Finn Russell in the South African setup. I just don't know whether he'd fit within the Erasmus style of play, and so I think he'd almost be wasted. But then I looked at a guy like Hugh Jones. I think is pretty exceptional, and he's sort of an honorary South. He spent a lot of time in South Africa. Was at uni there, and has a lot of friends in Cape Town. So someone like him, I think, is exceptional as well. I think that he has just come on in leaps and bounds in his ability to play sort of 12, 13, 15. I think he's a pretty exceptional player. And I think that if there was a guy that I could poach for South Africa from Scotland, I'd probably say Hugh Jones.
Yeah. Well, I would, to be honest, if it was a South African, I could pinch. I would probably pick, just on the basis that I love amazing back threes, I'd pick Mapimpi and pair him with Darcy Graham as the two wingers, because I hope that I keep saying this, and I hope the Babas hear me sometime. That's the back. And in terms of Ireland, I mean, obviously we're going to have Jay on at some point to talk about Ireland and what a similar sort of vein. What is it you fear most about Ireland as a South African fan?
Just how clinical they are. They are a team which is, I believe, and this means no disrespect to their individual players who are fantastic, but they are a team that's more than the sum of their parts. I think that Ireland's strength is just how unbelievably clinical and how well coached they are, and how they just seem to find ways to win. It's probably why we, as fans, just find it so frustrating. You find losing to like a Leinster B team really frustrating, and you're just like, how do these guys keep doing it? How do Ireland keep doing it? They just sort of have this unbelievable procession of people that they slot in, and everyone knows their role intimately, and they just perform. And so, from a South African perspective, it's annoying sometimes because, perhaps arrogantly, I look at the lineups, the 1 to 50. I'm like, yeah, I think we've got them there. I think we've got an edge there. We've got an edge there. But just collectively, just how well they're coached and how well they're drilled, it's really tricky. I think one area where it's going to be interesting, South Africa versus Ireland, is just the kicking game, because I think that Keenan is an unbelievable fullback, and they've got some pretty handy wingers as well. So that's one area they're really willing to take us on, and that's obviously been a traditional strength for us. But we're finding even in the scrums, even in the mauls and in the lineups, which traditionally has been our sort of domain, they've really come for us and sort of bested us at times. I think that it's the ongoing one about Andrew Porter and how that man keeps winning penalties, but with his scrum technique. But he does, and he gets the job done. And Ireland keep winning penalties, and they keep being successful. So I think that they are the best team in the world. They are probably World Cup favourites, along with France and New Zealand, South Africa. Those full teams, but probably Ireland has the best claim to being favourites, I'd say. But then there's always they've got their own issues. You do question how convincing the depth is at 10, and particularly given the circumstances that currently surround Sexton. So there's always that element. Teams will always look to target that part of their game and put pressure on there. I think it's going to be an almighty tussle. I think that Ireland versus New Zealand, if it does happen, would be a very, very interesting fixture. Because I think that New Zealand, Yeah, I don't know. I think that'd just be a really, really fantastic game of rugby. I'm just very happy to see other teams that are really, really good fight each other in the knockouts. I just like to try and avoid that if possible.
Yeah, I mean the prospect of getting out of the group that Scotland and South Africa and Ireland find themselves in is, I think it's probably France or New Zealand. So it's not exactly the
Yeah.
greatest prospects once you get to that stage. One last thing, and just about South African rugby, I tend to find that obviously during the Lions tour, it seemed like at times that South Africans maybe felt that it was the world against them and all that stuff. Is that like a mentality you think that leads to them winning things? Because they seem obviously, no matter how frustrated you get with South Africa, how much you think they're down and out, they're always in it. And is that a kind of mentality that South African fans tend to have, that they're just, it's us against the world when we play rugby? And I'm not saying that South African fans aren't friendly. I went to the Sevens World Cup in San Francisco and had a blast with loads of South Africans around me. But just is that the kind of mentality that fans have when it comes to the game?
Yeah, the psychology and almost pathology of South African rugby is a really interesting one. It's a very good question, actually, because I've been thinking about this a lot. I sort of struggle sometimes to understand why South Africa really struggle when they are favourites in games. We seem to need to be underdogs. We seem to need to have this idea of the world against us in order to perform, which I find like immensely frustrating as a South African fan. Like the example I use is, in the last rugby championship, we played probably our best game all year. It was our first game against New Zealand in Nelspruit and Bombela. And we basically played them off the park and played a phenomenal game of rugby and won that. And the next week it was, this is fantastic. Let's go out and win the second game in a row. It was in Ellis Park, also in South Africa. To really, one swallow does not a summer make. But if we beat the All Blacks twice consecutively, that will really announce ourselves. And then we went and lost that game very narrowly after basically bottling a lead at the very end. And I sort of thought to myself, it's really frustrating that we can never seem to succeed when we're seen as favourites, or when we have the belief that we might be expected to win a game, we tend to choke it or bottle it somehow. And so I think that plays into this really odd sort of having to feel that we're always underdogs, having to feel like the world is against us. I mean, sometimes it's more valid than others. Sometimes we really are the underdogs. Sometimes we are written off and have come out swinging as a result of it. But I think it's that twin element of pride. South Africans are, rugby fans are immensely prideful people, and I think it's sort of that combined with this sort of need to have this underdog element to really kick us into gear that sometimes I think spills over into this sort of siege mentality. Having said that, I think sometimes it can be overstated. I think that South Africa are not the first, even if they are the most vociferous, to sort of feel like they've been cheated or screwed, or this, that, the other. I think that it's common amongst all fan bases at one time or another, even if it perhaps is the most common amongst African fans, which I'll freely admit. But yeah, it's an interesting one. I think for me, it's now to the point where it's just a bit tiresome, and I do hope that we finally turned a corner. I suspect that I do get the impression that we have, hopefully, if not as fans, at least as within the actual rugby administration. And I do look at the coaches, and not a veiled thing. I mean, Erasmus. I do hope that the penny is sort of dropped, as it were. And I think that some of the noises I've seen coming from the camp have indicated that. I think that it's sort of, yeah. I think that hopefully there's now going to be a bit more sensible, cool heads prevailing.
I've got just a couple more questions that are a little bit more general. In terms of South Africa, when it comes to international rugby, they play the rugby championship, obviously, with New Zealand, Australia, Argentina, Southern Hemisphere teams, and then they play in the URC. And then looking at the squad, there's players that play in Japan and France and England across the squad. Do you think that gives South Africa a massive advantage? I mean, Scotland maybe have players in England and France, but South Africa seem to have players from all around the world coming together. Do you think that gives an advantage to them, that they understand the styles of other teams better because of that diversity?
Yes and no. I mean, the first point I'll say is that it's not, it's not an optimal situation having 50% of your squad or 50% of your starting team playing outside of your country. It's not really very good for your domestic rugby, to be truthful. To have in excess of 450 professional players playing outside of South Africa, and guys who are really, really good at rugby. Not only do you have guys who then obviously choose to further their international careers abroad instead of in South Africa. I mean, that's pretty commonplace now, and most international teams have some South African somewhere in the squad or have had. Um, so that's one element of it, but really it does sort of threaten to hollow out your domestic game. So it's actually been fairly remarkable from my mind how competitive South Africa's local teams have been in the URC, truth be told, because I sort of look at the amount of talent that is overseas and I sort of think, well, if these guys are applying their trade in South Africa, not only does it add enormous amount of depth and talent to your existing squads, it also means that players coming through are exposed to those types of guys in that type of environment, which makes them rounded and more skillful players in the long run. So the negative element of it is ultimately having that many players abroad does negatively impact your domestic rugby setup, but it can't not. And ultimately, that domestic rugby setup is what feeds through to the national team. So there's no way that it doesn't have a negative impact in that. And I think anybody who tries to downplay that isn't really being truthful. But then there is also the positive element on it. And that's all the things that you mentioned, is that you get exposure to different styles of play, different teams, you get insight. And I think, truthfully speaking, a lot of the South African, international team at the moment have left South Africa and become better rugby players. A guy like Cheslin Colby, everyone likes to say, how is this guy not picked for South Africa? Stormers fans particularly love to say, how is this guy not picked for South Africa? He's, obviously such an amazing player. But the Cheslin Colby that left South Africa is not the Cheslin Colby that was selected for the Springboks for the first time. He was a very, very different player and wasn't meriting Springbok call up when he was in South Africa. It's just as simple as that. It's the same thing with guys like you see, champions like Raymond Rule. I mean, he was a Springbok at the time, but he was pretty widely derided. He's gone and taken his game to the next level in France. Dylan Late, same story. So you get these guys who obviously go overseas, experience different cultures, experiencing new coaches, and become much, much better, more rounded players as a result. And that is obviously to South Africa's benefit at the top level. So at the Springbok level, it is beneficial having teams having players all over the world. But yeah, there's the question about what that means for the pipeline, what that means for your domestic setup, what that means in 10 years and looking long term, which is a bit more intangible. So that's why I say I think there's positives and negatives to it. But yeah, at the very highest level, looking only at Springbok rugby in the short term, I'd say it's a definite benefit.
Very, very in-depth answer. And yeah, I can see the negative too. If you don't have a domestic setup, where do the kids go to start off their career, whether they go to France later or whatever? So that makes a lot of sense. Last one, you mentioned obviously Khaleesi's currently injured, as I understand it. Who's the captain in his absence?
Interesting one. I think we'll find out on Tuesday when they eventually name it. It'll either be Duane Vermeulen or Lukhanyo Am, I suspect. Given that Andre Pollard is also injured at the moment and he's the vice captain, and so would, I believe, naturally have stepped into being the captain. Both those guys are, very experienced, big leaders. Lukhanyo Am is captain of the Sharks, and so leadership is nothing new to him. Yeah, it'll either be Duane Vermeulen or Lukhanyo Am. Who's better? I don't know. Maybe they go with a sort of co-captain structure. I mean, this is sort of how South Africa's always operated, even if it's never been in name. But when Khaleesi was first made captain, he was made captain understanding that there were elements of his leadership that he needed assistance with. He was never the type of guy. He's never like a Richie McCaw who could sort of take the team on his own back and handle all elements of the leadership, or someone like potentially, Owen Farrell, who's a bit like that as well. He's always had a team of leaders around him. And it was to Erasmus and Khaleesi's credit that they recognized that that's what needed to happen. Khaleesi came in, Duane Vermeulen was always involved, senior members of the team, Andre Pollard was always involved in all the decision making. A lot of the communication with referees initially was done actually by Duane Vermeulen. And then later, as Khaleesi grew in confidence and became a better communicator, he took over that role. So again, we might see something similar where, one person, whether it be Duane or Lukhanyo, is named as captain, but there's always a core leadership group which will involve, the very experienced senior players who will collectively make decisions, collectively do communication, et cetera, et cetera.
Cool. And then one last question, perhaps the most difficult one to answer. Call it now. Who's winning the World Cup, and where does South Africa finish? It might be the same answer, but
same answer. South Africa's winning, 100%. No, I got to back our boys. Really, what kind of South African would I be if I said we weren't going to win? But yeah, no, I think look, it's any of the top sort of six teams. There's about six teams that could realistically win this, depending on the bounce of the ball in one game, or just getting a good route to the final, or getting on a bit of a roll. You can't discount anybody. Obviously the sort of four that everyone mentions, but then Scotland, England, Argentina, Australia, all of them are in with a shot. I think it's probably the most open World Cup we've seen in probably as long as I've been alive. And I think it's a tantalizing prospect for fans that you can go in and genuinely not have any idea who like the real favorite is. And I think that's a very exciting position to be. But yeah, I think I've got to hope that South Africa have enough of a dogged spirit to take it through. It won't be easy. I think, unfortunately for us three, for Ireland, South Africa, and Scotland, we've got probably the hardest route to any potential glory. But wouldn't want it any other way.
Yeah, no, you've got to beat them if you're going to win it, right? So, one last bonus question: are you looking forward to Wales playing in the qualifiers for the 2027 World Cup? I just felt I had to give them some kind of dig, just to stay.
Yeah, you had to. Yeah, where there's no one for them to answer. Yeah. It's a tricky one. You do got to feel for Wales. I mean, it's a mess of their own making in many ways. And I think that they recognise that. But Wales are such passionate rugby fans, and in many ways, it's actually the fan base I think that most closely mirrors South Africans. And whenever I'm in Wales, it's amazing chatting to those guys. They're so passionate, they're so intense, and I think it's the same type of thing where that passion often spills over into madness, which is a classic South African trait as well. But yeah, I really hope for them, for their sake, they can come good. But we'll see.
Brilliant. And is there anyone you want to give a shout out to on the podcast? Then we can kind of cajole them into listening. It helps the numbers.
Okay, brilliant. No, yeah, who to give that shout out to? That's not a good question. Sorry, I should have had this ready to go. I mean, you're going to have Jay on next, so yeah, that obviously he's a good guy. But yeah, I think probably just the guys at Rugby Bits. If you guys don't, if any listeners of us don't follow them, they're really good. Tala and Jared and everyone there. So yeah, follow the guys at Rugby Bits. They're really good podcast as well, and give a good South African perspective. So shout out to them.
Thanks very much. Thanks for your time this morning.
Cheers. Thanks so much.